Old Lin stops and challenges Bukele once again, this time not just with a message. This time he did something that crossed the line. But what did he do? Did he murder someone? Stay until the end of the video and find out. Old Lin, the feared leader of the Mara, walked slowly through the narrow corridors of the Siet prison. His dark, penetrating eyes didn't miss a single detail, assessing every corner, every guard, and every inmate. Since his arrival, his presence had been a constant shadow over the prison, despite the harsh conditions. Lin never lost his iron will or his dangerous cunning. Day after day, Lin watched and listened. He had learned that in the bowels of the Siet, information was more valuable than any weapon. Over time, he began to devise a bold and ruthless plan. It wasn't just about escaping, but also about sending a message to the president. Nayib Bukele, who had sworn to destroy his organization on a dark and rainy night. Lin summoned his trusted men, all loyal to the death, to the small cell. Under the dim light of a flickering bulb, he outlined his plan. The objective was to kidnap President Bukele's daughter. The silence was profound, filled with disbelief and fear. But when Lin spoke, his voice was firm and calculated, filling his men with a fierce determination. The first step was to obtain key information about the presidential family's routine within the Siet. Lin had an informant, a corrupt guard who needed money to pay his debts in exchange for a considerable sum. The guard began to leak information about the movements of Bukele's daughter, Gabriela. It was learned that every Tuesday and Thursday, she attended an exclusive piano class at a private conservatory, a place where security was less strict. Meanwhile, outside from the walls of the Siet, the gang members were preparing. Armando, one of Lin's most trusted lieutenants, took command and recruited a group of gang members ready to carry out the kidnapping. The team was well-trained and motivated, each with their own specific role. During the operation, they made sure they had weapons, vehicles, and a safe haven to hide Gabriela once she was captured. On the day of the kidnapping, the atmosphere was tense. The gang members took up positions around the conservatory. Armando and two other gang members posed as delivery men for a catering company, taking advantage of an event being held. Two others were waiting in a vehicle parked a few meters from the entrance. When Gabriela left the conservatory, accompanied only by a bodyguard, the gang members acted with military precision. Armando and his team quickly overpowered the bodyguard, disarming him and knocking him unconscious in a nearby alley. Within seconds, Gabriela was forced into the vehicle, which started with a squeal of tires inside the building. Old Lin waited calmly. He knew uneasily that at that moment, the fate of his plan depended on the skill and loyalty of his men. Upon receiving the signal that the operation had been a success, he allowed a rare smile to cross his face. However, the real challenge was just beginning. The news of Gabriela Bukele's kidnapping exploded like a bomb throughout the country. The media, social networks, and public opinion erupted in frenzied coverage. Furious and desperate, Bukele mobilized all security forces to find his daughter. The situation was extremely delicate, and any false step could have disastrous consequences. In their hideout, the Maras treated Gabriela with surprising respect. She was a valuable asset, and in a way, a life insurance for them. Armuring himself, he was responsible for communicating Ellen's demands to the government, the release of several gang leaders, and safe passage out of the country. Negotiations were tense, and time was an implacable enemy within the Siet. Attention was also palpable. President Bukele, with no other option, agreed to negotiate. He knew that his daughter's safety was above any principle or campaign promise. However, he also planned a covert operation to recover Gabriela without giving in to Lin's demands. Days passed, and the negotiations continued in a tense back and forth. Finally, an exchange was agreed upon in a remote location. Lin, from his cell, directed every detail of the plan. The Marines delivered Gabriela safe and sound. But before they could celebrate their victory, they were ambushed by government special forces. The operation was swift and lethal. Armando and several gang members fell in the confrontation. Although Gabriela was rescued, Lin had managed to send a clear message, and even from behind bars, his power and influence were unshakable. Bukele's measures. The news of Gabriela Bukele's rescue was received with relief throughout El Salvador. However, for Old Lin and the Mara, victory had been short-lived. The covert operation by the government's special forces had been devastating. Armando and several of his men had fallen in the clash, and the survivors were arrested and returned to the prison with an even greater level of security in their Zelda. Old man Lin watched the cold glow of a moon through a small window in his cell. He knew his time was running out. Bukele, enraged and determined to crush any hint of resistance, had ordered exemplary punishment for Lin and the remaining Mara leaders. President Bukele was quick to act, with the support of the public and the international community. For his part, he intensified security measures in the second. Lin was moved to an even more restrictive cell, isolated by his followers. Visits were reduced to a strict minimum, severely limiting his ability to communicate with the outside world. In addition to Njib's isolation, Bukele ordered a comprehensive review of conditions inside the second. The government implemented draconian measures aimed at weakening the influence of the gangs within the prison. They reduced inmate privileges, confiscated illicit assets, and increased security measures. Throughout the complex, it was a silent but relentless war against the gang and its personal leader, Naib. Bukele was more determined than ever to put an end to Old Lin and his criminal legacy. In press conferences and public speeches, he bluntly denounced the threat the gangs posed to national security and the well-being of the country. He promised a relentless fight against organized crime, using all the resources at his disposal to achieve this. For Lin, each day became a battle for survival and sanity. The oppressive routine and constant surveillance, it wore him down physically and mentally. However, his indomitable spirit continued. Burning inside him, he planned strategies, albeit secretly, to maintain cohesion within his gang and prepare for an eventual return to power. Meanwhile, the pressure on the Maranos eased. Police and military operations intensified in areas controlled by the gang. Mass arrests and seizures of drugs and weapons became a daily strategy. The government sought to weaken the Mara's structure from its foundations, cutting off any possibility of resurgence. As the months passed, the situation became unsustainable for the Mara. The strength of the government and Nayib Bukele's determination to eradicate organized crime began to bear fruit. Little by little, the Maranos' influence inside and outside the second faded. Their numbers diminished. Their operations diminished. The figure became more clandestine. From Old Lin, he went from being a feared legend to a recluse in decline. By the way, if you enjoy this video, we invite you to give us a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. We continue the beginning of the end after the direct confrontation between President Nayib Bukele and Old Lin in the second prison. The campaign against gangs in El Salvador intensified. Bukele, determined to eradicate the influence of the Maras in the country, ordered an unprecedented search and capture operation specifically targeting members of the gang. The operation, dubbed Mano Dura Definitiva, was designed to be swift, effective, and brutal. The deployment of police and military forces was massive. Troops and armored vehicles patrolled the streets of cities and towns where the Maras were known to operate. Helicopters constantly flew over the most conflictive areas using advanced surveillance technology. To track down gang members, the raids were carried out with military precision, with elite teams breaking into homes and hideouts at any time of day or night. The order was clear: no Mara should escape. Authorities kept lists with names and photos of suspects, and each capture was a trophy to show the public. Newscasts broadcast the raids live, showing gang members being arrested and taken handcuffed to police vehicles. Vio wanted everyone to see the power of the state in action and understand that there would be no truce. The treatment of captured gang members was harsh, bordering on the inhumane. During the raids, the officers showed no mercy. The orders were clear: intimidate, humiliate, and punish the Mara from the moment they were released. The prisoners were taken from their hiding places, beaten, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the streets. Police vehicles were used without any regard for their well-being. In temporary detention centers, the situation did not improve. The gang members were subjected to brutal interrogations to extract information about their operations and contacts. Physical violence was a common tactic. Hitting, kicking, and the use of tools to inflict pain were part of the process. The prisoners were deprived of sleep and food, and kept in overcrowded, filthy cells where desperation and fear reigned. Transfers to the second mega-prison were another episode of terror for the gang. Chained and crammed into trucks, they were transported for hours under the blazing sun without food or water. The guards made sure to maintain an atmosphere of constant oppression, with shouts, insults, and beatings that never ceased. Many arrived at the Sikot already wounded and weakened, barely able to stand. The reception was even more brutal. The prisoners were forced to run through a kind of gauntlet formed by guards armed with batons and sticks. Every step toward the prison entrance was accompanied by blows and kicks. The conditions inside the Sekhet, already hellish, worsened with each new group of prisoners that arrived. The overcrowded cells, the lack of resources, and the constant threat of violence made prison life hell. Meanwhile, Bukele continued his media campaign, using social media and the media to showcase the results of the operations, assuring the public that the government was taking drastic measures to restore peace and security. Images of captured gang members and the destruction of their hideouts became symbols of state power. Bukele presented himself as the strong and determined leader that El Salvador needed to free itself from the yoke of gangs. The Bukele government had implemented a series of drastic measures to dismantle gang power. Raids and arrests became the norm, and prisons were overcrowded. Of gang members, Bukele had publicly declared that he would not rest until El Salvador was free from the influence of the Mara and other criminal organizations. However, Old Man Lin was not someone who was easily intimidated. From his headquarters in a maximum security prison, he continued to direct his gang's operations with an iron fist. The government's attempts to dismantle his organization had only made Lin more cautious and strategic. One night, while the city slept, a secret meeting was held in a safe house in the slums of San Salvador. The Mara leaders had gathered to discuss their next move. Old Man Lin, with his commanding presence and penetrating gaze, led the meeting. President Bukele believes he can destroy us with his raids and arrests, Lin said, his voice echoing in the small room. But he doesn't understand that we are more than one. The gang leaders nodded, their faces filled with determination. Lin knew that to counter the government's offensive, they needed to be smarter and more organized. They decided to intensify their operations, attacking not only law enforcement, but also those who supported Bukele. Meanwhile, at the presidential palace, Bukele was aware of the gang's movements. He had received intelligence reports indicating an increase in gang activity. The gang knew Lin was planning something big and couldn't afford to underestimate it. We need to get ahead of them, Bukele told his security team. Lin is dangerous, but not invincible. We must dismantle his network. From within, Bukele ordered a series of covert operations to infiltrate the gang and gather vital information. Government agents began moving stealthily, trying to gain the trust of the gang members. At the same time, Bukele intensified his campaign. Media coverage, ensuring that the Salvadoran people knew they were doing everything possible to protect them. The tension on the streets of San Salvador was palpable. Clashes between law enforcement and gang members became more frequent and violent. Nighttime raids and covert operations put the city on a constant state of alert. One night, during one of these raids, government special forces managed to capture one of Old Man Lin's trusted lieutenants. Under intense pressure, the lieutenant revealed crucial details about the gang's plans and Lin's hideouts. With this information in hand, Buke saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow. The operation to capture Lin was carried out with military determination. Special forces stormed Lin's hideout in the early hours of the morning, surprising the gang. After a brief but intense firefight, Old Man Lin was captured. News of his capture spread quickly, and the entire city felt a mixture of relief and fear of reprisals. Held in prison from the first day, Lin realized that the prison system was designed to break the strongest men. The guards, following strict orders, made sure that Lin knew that here he wouldn't have the power or influence he had on the streets. He was led to his cell, his hands and feet chained, his dignity crushed with every step he took. Lin found a small, dark, and dirty space. The bed was a hard wooden board, and the toilet was a simple bucket. There was no privacy, and light barely came in through a small, barred window. The loneliness was crushing, but it was only the beginning. The guards made it their personal mission to break Lin. They woke him up at all hours of the night, banging on the bars with their batons, hurling insults and threats at him during meals. They made sure to serve him the worst pieces of food that were often cold and rotting. Every interaction with the guards, it was a test of endurance, and Lin knew that any sign of weakness would be ruthlessly exploited. The other prisoners, many of whom were from rival gangs, also saw Lena as a perfect target. Rumors of her downfall had spread quickly, and for them, Lena was an opportunity to gain a reputation. In the first few days, Lin had to defend himself against constant attacks, using all his skills and cunning to survive. The fights were fierce and bloody, and although Lin managed to emerge victorious, each confrontation left his body more bruised and his hatred deeper. In those moments of loneliness and pain, Lin thought of Bukele. Every blow, every insult, every sleepless night fueled his resentment. He knew his suffering was part of the president's strategy to weaken the Mara, but Lin wouldn't be broken so easily. His mind worked tirelessly, planning his revenge and how to restore his power. One of the most humiliating moments for Lin came when the guards decided to teach him an exemplary lesson. They took him to an isolated section of the prison where he was handcuffed and brutally beaten. The blows were relentless, and the guards made sure each one left a mark. Lin, although in pain, he didn't utter a single cry, resisting with a strength that only intensified his hatred. As the weeks passed, Lin grew accustomed to the brutality. His beloved body grew stronger with each day. He kept his mind sharp, remembering every detail of his torture, every face of the guards, every insult. He knew revenge wouldn't be quick or easy, but he was determined to strike back in a way that Bukele would never forget. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, we invite you to give us your like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new videos. We continue the message of the old Lena Bukele. The days in jail turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Old Lin, hardened by the brutality of prison, had not lost an ounce of his cunning and determination. Every blow, every insult, and every attempt to break him only served to reinforce his hatred of President Nayib Bukele. Despite the strict security measures and constant surveillance, Lin had managed to establish a communication network with his loyalists on the outside. His former gang mates, who still operated in the shadows of San Salvador, were willing to do whatever was necessary to restore their leader's power. One day, while in his cell, Lin received a signal from one of the guards, a man he had managed to bribe through his external network. The guard slipped a small note under his cell door, informing him that everything was ready to send a message to Bukele. He smiled, knowing this would be the first step in his plan for revenge, with a cunning that had made him the feared leader of the Lin gang. Lin planned a plan to get his message across to the president using codes and coded messages. Lin sent detailed instructions to his men. Outside, the message had to be clear and forceful, a direct warning to Bukele that his capture did not mean the end. One night, under the cover of darkness, Lin's loyalists infiltrated the city with clockwork precision, executing their plan. Within hours, graffiti appeared at several strategic points in San Salvador, all with the same message: Bukele, this is not over. I will escape and I will come for you, Lin. The message spread like wildfire. The citizens of San Salvador woke up to the news and the images of the graffiti. The media covered the story extensively, speculating about the implications of the threat tensions in the city increased, and security was further tightened around the president at the presidential palace. Bukele received the news with a mixture of surprise and fury. He couldn't believe Lin had managed to send him a threat from prison, maximum security. This demonstration of power and resilience by Old Man Lin was a direct affront to his authority and a reminder that the fight against the gangs was far from over. Bukele called an emergency meeting with his security team. "This man remains a threat even behind bars," Bukele said, his voice filled with determination. "We cannot allow his followers to maintain this communication network. I want them to redouble their efforts to completely isolate him." Meanwhile, in his cell, Lin learned of the impact of his message through his contacts within the prison. He learned that Buk had increased security measures and that the government was on high alert. Lin allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. He had managed to send his warning and plant the seed of fear in the heart of his enemy. But the message wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Lin continued to meticulously plan his escape. He knew it would be a long process and dangerous, but he was determined to carry out his threat. With each passing fall, he worked to strengthen his network inside and outside the prison by bribing guards, manipulating other prisoners, and using every resource at his disposal. The guards, although more vigilant than ever, were unable to stop Lin. His network of loyalists expanded and communication was maintained. Every small success, every message sent and received gave him more confidence and fueled his determination. Lin knew that his escape was possible, and with each passing day, his plan drew closer to execution. Outside, gang violence increased partly as a context and partly as a show of power. The Maras, following Lin's orders, intensified their activities, keeping the government occupied and diverting attention from their leaders' true plans. The city descended into controlled chaos, all while Lin moved his chess pieces from inside his cell. Finally, the day came when Lin felt ready to execute his escape. The week's planning, bribery, and manipulation culminated in a dark and stormy night with the help of his allies inside and outside prison. Lin managed to escape, leaving behind a trail of chaos and confusion. When news of Lin's escape reached Bukele, his face darkened. He knew this was just the beginning. Lin was free, and with his freedom came the promise of revenge. The battle between the president and the Mara leader was far from over, and Salvador was preparing for a new era of conflict where cunning and determination would decide the fate of a nation. And so we come to the end of this video. If you liked it, I invite you to give us a like so we can continue making more videos like this. Also, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our new videos. I wish you a great day. Until next time.